Taking a look at our first reading from John Stuart Mill's Utilitarianism. This is a really very readable. I mean, okay, it's still challenging, but we're getting closer to modern prose. It was written in 1863, and reading Mill is really not so difficult. Certainly not as difficult as the things we have been reading, I think, generally speaking. But just a few remarks about what's going on here. This is an introductory section. He doesn't introduce his big principle, the greatest happiness principle, but he refers to it. It's almost as if he kind of knows or figures that his readers have some notion of what he's talking about just by calling the thing utilitarianism and referring to the greatest happiness principle and so forth. But so even though he doesn't get to the big principle in this first reading, it's a valuable introduction to give us a sense of what he's doing or what he believes he's doing, what kind of approach he's taking, and what he hopes to be able to establish. I just took some excerpts from the work, which I thought were particularly key. The first thing he mentions is the question of the criterion of right and wrong, and he has some very interesting things to say about how he lives in the 19th century, the progress of science and technology and industry and democracy and capitalism, let's face it, is all sort of going forward, and the much commented upon irony of all that is that we human beings seem to be making so much progress in terms of our understanding of the world, but very little progress in terms of our understanding of morality. And what he thinks we really need to do is to settle upon what the criterion is for right and wrong. And it's important to think about what that word criterion means: a standard, a rule, something that we can refer to make decisions. Let's say, what is the criterion for deciding whether somebody is a good baseball player? I mean, which is tough. Well, my criterion would be that they bat above a certain average and that they commit not above a certain number of errors in the field. It's my criterion. I could specify it, but if you ask me whether Joe Smith is a good baseball player and you tell me his stats, I would look at my criteria. Say, batting over 250 and making fewer than one error a week in the field or something, whatever it is. And I look at his stats and I see what he did. Did he bat over 250 and make no more than one error a week? Yes. Well, he's a good player. Did he bat below 250 and make more than one error a week? Then he's a bad player. That is, a criterion is a specific sort of thing. It's a standard by which we're able to make judgments. And that's what Mill is looking for. And that's what Mill thinks that we need to do in morality. And there's a very interesting discussion here comparing morality with other fields of study like natural science and mathematics. And he says, the fundamental principles of algebra are gobbledygook. I mean, nobody knows what they are. But algebra is doing fine. And it may be that the fundamental principles, the fundamental standards of, say, physics, nobody knows what they are, but physics seems to be doing fine. That is, in some fields of study, you don't need to have clear first principles to get on with the study. But as he says here, morality it may be different. Quote is, but though in science the particular truths precede the general theory, that is, you can find out things that are true in physics without having at your command clear first principles, the contrary might be expected to be the case with a practical art such as morals or legislation, which is very, to a utilitarian's mind, legislation is very important, because that morality should guide legislation, should guide laws. All action is for the sake of some end. That is very Aristotelian, right? We always act for some end or purpose. And rules of action, it seems natural to suppose, must take their whole character and color from the end to which they are subservient. When we engage in a pursuit, a clear and precise conception of what we are pursuing would seem to be the first thing we need, instead of the last we are to look forward to. A test of right and wrong must be the means, one would think, of ascertaining what is right or wrong, and not a consequence of already having it. Having already ascertained it. As in physics, we may do really successful physics and then decide what the first principles are. But in morality, since we're making choices about what end to pursue, we can't make the first step with having some guiding first principle that would establish what our end is. So what he's arguing is that, sure, in many fields of study, finding out, clarifying what the first principles are, what the foundations are, is really maybe not all that important most of the time. But morality is different, because morality is about pursuing ends, and to decide what end to pursue, we need that criterion of right and wrong. So that's what we'll be looking for. That's what he will be presenting and then defending in this work, his criterion of right and wrong, and saying that we really need to clarify that. So looking for the principle or the criterion, he does a quick reference to other people's ideas, and he says, according to the one opinion, the principles of morals are evident a priori, that is, without any kind of experience, we know it through pure reason, requiring nothing to command assent except that the meaning of the terms be understood. I think that it's a fair way to characterize Kant's categorical imperatives. That is, that all my actions must be universalizable, and that I must treat all persons with respect. I think he has things like that in mind. Like some people think, well, all you need to do is understand what those things are saying, and you will see that they're true. And Mill is rejecting that. I mean, that is that he doesn't believe that that's the right way to go about it. And he mentions Kant later on specifically as being a great thinker who failed, basically. So a little bit later, Mill says there ought either to be some one fundamental principle or law at the root of all morality, or if there be several, there should be a determinate order of precedence among them. And the one principle, or the rule for deciding between the various principles when they conflict, ought to be self-evident. That is, we ought to be able to come to a basic meaning lowest level, sort of what is, there ought to be a fundamental criterion or principle or foundation for morality, and that ought to be self-evident, like it must be obviously true. Not clear how he completely differentiates that from what he said before about a priori principles, but it gives you a sense of what he's looking for. A self-evidently true, non-contentious sort of thing that we can all say, oh yeah, that's got to be true. It's self-evidently true, and it's at the basis of our notion of right and wrong, or it is what we refer to when we're trying to decide what's right and wrong. It's what he's a fundamental principle. I mean, not all fields have it, but morality, he says, should. And he gives us some foreshadowing of what he will be proposing as that fundamental principle when he says the principle of utility, or as Bentham, who was a generation earlier of moral philosophers, British moral philosopher, very important, who was really kind of like the father of utilitarianism. I don't think he called it that. The principle of utility, or as Bentham latterly called it, the greatest happiness principle. This is familiar to all of us, the greatest good for the greatest number, more or less, has had a large share in forming the moral doctrines of even those who most scornfully reject its authority. Basically saying what he will be arguing in this book is that we're all utilitarians, whether we know it or not. And even if we consciously reject the idea of being utilitarians, we're still utilitarians. Because he's arguing that there is one fundamental principle that guides our morality. Not only that it should guide our morality, but what people like Bentham thought, well, it already does. It's just so built into our way of looking at the world. And even a thinker like Kant, even though he would have rejected any utilitarian label, was kind of like secretly a utilitarian. It's kind of interesting. When Mill mentions Kant, he says, Kant, this remarkable man, whose system of thought will long remain one of the landmarks in the history of philosophical speculation, like giving his due regards, his respect, all due respect for Kant. Even Kant does, in the treatise in question, lay down a universal first principle as the origin and ground of moral obligation. It is this: so act that the rule in which thou actest would admit of being adopted as a law by all rational beings, which is essentially, we know, the first version of the categorical imperative, universalizability. But when he begins to deduce from this precept any of the actual duties of morality, he fails, almost grotesquely, to show that there would be any contradiction, any logical, not to say physical, impossibility in the adoption by all rational beings of the most outrageously immoral rules of conduct. That is, what Mill is saying is that Kant fails to show that it would be completely possible to will basically anything as a universal law. I mean, there'd be no logical contradiction. There's no logical impossibility in me saying, well, I'm going to lie. My maximum of action in this situation would be I'm going to lie to my advantage. There's no logical contradiction in saying, and I will that be a universal law for everyone. And then Mill continues and says, all he shows is that the consequences of their universal adoption would be such as no one would choose to incur, which is essentially saying that Kant is a secret utilitarian, because he's saying, well, no one would want to live in a world where everyone lied. That would have bad consequences. It would make it a worse world. But that is exactly Mill's point, is that that's a utilitarian standard that Kant is kind of secretly slipping in, which is an extremely interesting idea of Kant. So what will he be doing? Well, he will be proposing this greatest happiness principle, or utilitarianism, as the absolute foundation or criterion for morality, and criterion in the sense of being the criterion by which we judge whether an action is right or wrong. But then there's a question of proving it. But he has something very interesting to say about that. He says, I shall, without further discussion of the other theories, attempt to contribute something towards the understanding and appreciation of the utilitarian or happiness theory, and towards such proof as it is susceptible of. It is evident that this cannot be proof in the ordinary and popular meaning of the term. Questions of ultimate ends, of the greatest good, are not amenable to direct proof. And that's interesting. For instance, if you say, well, the ultimate end and criterion of every, and he does suggest this, say that you say that pleasure is the ultimate good, like Aristotle considered and rejected. But if you say that pleasure is the ultimate good, that things are good if they bring pleasure, but then you can ask, well, why is pleasure good? There's really no answer to that, is what he's getting at. If you say that everything is good or bad according to whether it contributes to happiness, but then you ask, well, why is happiness good? There's no answer to that. This is where you have to make the claim that something is self-evident. So it's not that he thinks that there's no arguing for a first principle of morality, but it's not going to be able to be proved in any direct way, he says. I don't know. We'll have to see what ways it actually, it can be argued for. It can be proved, at least to some extent.